Hello, News-Decoders. Welcome to our webinar on human rights with Steve Crawshaw. My name is Nelson Graves, and I'm speaking to you from Paris, France. And I'm joined by Steve Crawshaw in London. Hello, Steve.
Hi, pleased to be here.
And also in Bloomington, Indiana, we have students at Indiana University with Professor Elaine Monahan. Hello, guys.
Hello.
By the way, Mr. Crawshaw and Ms. Monahan and myself are all former journalists, so there's hope for you out there who may be interested in that dodgy trade. Today's session is the first of the new academic year for our pilot institutions, and I can't think of a more important topic than human rights, or one that's more relevant to international relations. Now, before introducing Steve Crawshaw, a bit of housekeeping. We expect this session to last about 1 hour, and we'd like these webinars to be interactive. And for them to be interactive, we need your input, your questions and your comments. There's a chat room on your screen, and we urge you to please use it to ask any questions you like at any time. The students at Indiana University and Professor Monahan will be monitoring the questions as we go along. Now on to our speaker. Steve Crawshaw is an author and an activist with an unparalleled global perspective on human rights, resistance, and change. Mr. Crawshaw is director of the Office of the Secretary General at Amnesty International, which he joined as International Advocacy Director in 2010. From the newspaper's launch in 1986 until 2002, he was a journalist with The Independent, and there he reported on the East European revolutions, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the Balkan Wars. From 2002 until 2010, he worked for Human Rights Watch, first as UK director, and then as United Nations Advocacy Director. Co-author with John Jackson of the book Small Acts of Resistance, How Courage, Tenacity, and Ingenuity Can Change the World, which has a preface by Czech writer and statesman Václav Havel, and was published in 2010. His new book on creative nonviolence, Street Spirit, The Power of Protest and Mischief, with a foreword by Chinese activist and artist Ai Weiwei, will be published next year. With that, I'll turn it over to Steve. Steve, would you like to say anything before we start peppering you with questions?
Yeah, I think the peppering is always good, and as I was saying to you earlier, the tougher the questions, always the better. Yeah, no, you've laid it out there exactly. So on the one hand, sort of a career as a journalist, which I absolutely loved, and then for the past 15 years or so in two of the world's great human rights organizations, which has been a privilege. It's been interesting for me how those two things have overlapped. And then you mentioned the books. I'm actually on a sabbatical at the moment with the book that you mentioned there, Street Spirit, that comes out next year, which is, in a sense, pulling together what I saw and lived through as a journalist, including in Eastern Europe, but also elsewhere, and then later in the human rights organizations, and kind of about really what people can achieve and the amazing things they can achieve. And I think that you flagged with people before the Václav Havel essay, The Power of the Powerless, which in a sense goes at the heart of that. So thanks very much for inviting me, and I'm very happy to be here.
Terrific. Well, I'll start out with a question or two, but again, I urge anyone in the session to please use the chat room to send in your questions. And Elaine, I would urge you and the students in Indiana to intervene whenever whenever you have a question you'd like to ask. So with that, I'll ask the first question. Steve, you suggested that to prepare for today's session, we could do worse than to read The Power of the Powerless, which is a political essay written in 1978 by Václav Havel. The essay dissects the nature of the communist regime in Czechoslovakia at that time, and how such what he called a post-totalitarian regime can create dissidents of ordinary citizens. My question is, why did you suggest that we should read this essay?
I think it's a fantastic and fascinating essay. As I mentioned briefly before, I was always interested in Eastern Europe. I lived in Poland during some key periods, which we might come back to later, Czechoslovakia. I knew this essay, with apologies to those who did get through it and found it heavy going, because I'd actually forgotten before I went back to it. I mean, some of it's quite long and seems quite dense, but the heart of it is incredibly simple and was very, very provocative when it was written, which was that actually individuals together can create amazing change. And he has this lovely anecdote of the greengrocer who stands up and who does his little small acts of resistance. And then he seems to be suppressed, but crucially, he's lifted the curtain, peered behind the curtain, as Havel puts it, and shown us that it is possible, a great phrase of Havel's, which became a kind of emblematic phrase, it is possible to live in truth. So the greengrocer is like ordinary Czech guy, if you like, has managed to live in truth. And then the essay continues with its musings and comes at the end saying, actually, maybe all this change is like more imaginable than we think. And maybe we're, in a sense, too wrapped up in ourselves to believe. And I love I love the essay at the time and before any of the changes, but I think especially it's nice at the time he was really mocked for saying, like, this isn't going to happen. Like, you've got this dream, but fundamentally nothing's going to change. I think it's difficult for people to remember now quite how set that seemed. During the era of the Cold War, it seemed that that was just what it was. There was a one-party state, there was a Berlin Wall, there were two big blocks, and it was never going to change. And he looked forward to a time when actually people might do it. And it was incredible that 11 years after he wrote that in 1989, and I was very privileged to be there for it, his own native country kind of erupted, and literally within 10 days, the whole pyramid collapsed pretty much as he'd described it. And later, as you mentioned, a book that a friend and I wrote a few years ago, he actually was kind enough to write the preface. And it was about that. He himself said we were treated, Havel was treated like a Czech Don Quixote tilting at windmills. In other words, trying to achieve things which are impossible. So I love that idea of the impossible, and then it actually becomes real. And I say it was mocked, and people who try to do the same things now are constantly mocked. People explain to them why it's all so impossible, but actually change comes.
Well, the essay was written 37 years ago. It's 27 years since the fall of the Iron Curtain. What is there that is relevant about this essay today?
I guess the principles are pretty much universal. It was about a particular country, a particular time, a political system which has gone in the meantime. The most immediate kind of recent one, which is so similar in many ways, and happened just after the first book was published, in fact, was the Tahrir uprising, the uprising in Tahrir Square and across Egypt, where millions of people came out on the street, and people said, again, there were quotes from the US Secretary of State, from many others saying, this isn't going to achieve anything. Mubarak is just too strong, the then Egyptian leader. He's just too strong. He's not going to go. And enough Egyptians believe they created change. Now, in the meantime, many, many, many things have gone wrong in Egypt. But I think that principle, and what then admittedly briefly was called the Arab Spring, but that sense of people standing up and seizing control of their own destiny, if you like, was incredibly relevant then. And it remains relevant, a whole clutch of things from, Burma to so many other places, where people are told by outsiders, there's no point you doing anything because this is here to stay, and so you need to live with it. And then you get individuals, brave individuals, but also brave large numbers of ordinary people at a certain point come together. So I think that from Havel's essay very much remain universal messages.
Right. In your book, Small Acts of Resistance, you examine a large number of acts of defiance and subversion, actually, in the face of oppression. The book looks at some 90 such acts in countries as diverse as Congo, Colombia, and Myanmar. Among those 90 stories, which ones stand out in your mind as being particularly powerful and relevant?
The ones, to answer your question slightly different, the ones I'm particularly fond of are some of the ones which really acted almost as the starting point of the book, which is the incredible creativity that you often see in difficult times. And the book that I've been writing now, Street Spirit, has the same thing. And you mentioned Ai Weiwei wrote the foreword for that, which is one reason I went to him, because he, you know, living in very difficult times, being jailed himself and faced a lot of challenges, but he remained with his creativity and humor. So I guess partly because Poland is a country close to my heart. I was living there by chance at a really important time, and kind of framed, I suppose, my whole philosophy of how I understand the world, what I saw there. A couple of stories come from that. So I need to give a little bit of the backstory, as it were, for Poland, whose story is now...
Steve, I'm going to interrupt you for a second. Elaine, there's a bit of, we can hear you, so maybe if you mute your mic, there'll be less interference. Sorry about that.
Sorry.
Steve, go ahead. Yeah, please go ahead, Steve. Sorry, you were talking about Poland. Yeah.
No problem. A couple of the stories I will tell come from Poland, which are in the book. But the backstory needs to be understood, the context of Poland. And I think quite wrongly, amazing things that happened in Poland in 1980, 81, and then with Act Two, if you like, in 1989, kind of shouldn't be forgotten at all. People haven't forgotten about South Africa, quite rightly. Mandela, the end of apartheid, South Africa, the fall of the Berlin Wall is remembered. But all of these things, before Mikhail Gorbachev, the former Soviet leader, ever even came to power, in 1980, I happened to be living in Poland. I'd gone there, studied Russian. I'd gone to Poland to study theatre, and then I was teaching English. And I'd arrived there in 1978. And in 1980, August 1980, there was these huge strikes across the country. This involved something became known as Solidarity, a trade union, but really it was like an informal opposition movement, was described as being utterly, a crazy idea. Western commentators, Western politicians said, well, obviously they can't get these various things. It seemed as unlikely as something happened. Free elections in North Korea today. It really was that challenging to the then Soviet bloc when Leonid Brezhnev was still the Soviet leader, who was the guy who'd send tanks into many countries, left, right, and center. But Solidarity was so strong that it actually did win. It then got suppressed 16 months later, and tanks came on the street, so the skeptics could say, yeah, we told you so. So that's when a couple of my stories begin. Is in 1981, or 1982, especially December 81, 82, martial law was there, tanks across the country, people being beaten, arrested, tear gassed, what have you. Quite a lot of protests going on, but I love the really kind of surprising ones that go within them. So one of my favorites then is a story about a boycott of the television news. And in one place in particular in eastern Poland, but it later spread, we had the situation where people were saying, okay, we'll boycott the TV news between 7:30 and 8, and it's just a boycott. And others said, yeah, but we want to make it like visible. And so we will go out on the street during that half hour. And others said, yeah, but we want to link it to the TV. So they took the TV, disconnected it, put it out onto the window facing onto the street to show they weren't watching during that half hour. And then my favorite bit of this story is people who pull those two elements together saying, well, I like the TV bit, but I like being involved personally. So they would pick up their TV, they'd walk downstairs with it, they put it like in a wheelbarrow or a children's stroller or whatever, and would walk around the central square with the TV on their shoulders in the wheelbarrow or whatever. So you had people with no slogans at all, because then you get arrested, but carrying their TVs. And the police had no idea what to do. And eventually the only thing they found themselves able to do was to bring the curfew back from, instead of 11 o'clock in the evening, they brought it to 7 in the evening to try and keep people at home during the TV news. And people then just moved their protest to the 5 o'clock edition of the bulletin instead. So a nice kind of cheekiness, even when they seemed to have no power at all. It was cheeky. One of my other favorite stories, still Polish from a few years later, was a kind of almost anarchist group, really, the Orange Alternative, who had fabulous surreal humor. They came up with a bunch of, if you like, protests, actions, you should say more, because they always portrayed them not as protests, but as just joyous events. And one of them was a pro-communist set of demonstrations, at a time when, of course, they were fighting against one-party communism, but they called it pro-communist, and in particular in favor of the secret police, and they demanded better working hours for the secret police, saying it's really unfair they have to work 24/7, and they ought to be allowed an 8-hour day. And the poor secret policeman kind of didn't know where to look. I love those stories with their creativity and their humor at the same time as being beaten. But what I actually particularly love, and I think this is the bit which we should never forget, is that those stories, which seem just to be kind of cute little stories, first, they were pretty dangerous to do, but second, there was a kind of dotted line, a very gentle dotted line that linked those things and the collapse of communism itself. They're part of many, many, many other protests, obviously. But that one I described on the police was in late 1988. Within a few months after that, Solidarity, which had been banned a few years earlier, 8 years earlier, was 7 years earlier, was re-legalized. And in June the following year, it became, it was able to take part in elections, completely defeated the communists so much they actually got a non-communist prime minister, Solidarity prime minister in August 1989. And then, the final postscript of the story is that 3 months after that, the Berlin Wall came down. So if you like, it's about the things that happened out of the headlines, but actually had incredibly important implications. And too often the politicians wake up only after the really, really big stuff has happened, but they don't see the little kind of fragments of things that have happened before that. And I love that, of looking at the little pebbles on the beach, if you want, it makes such a big difference.
Right. I'll ask another question before turning over to Indiana. There's a bit of feedback, I think, from Indiana. It may be because you've muted your laptop, Elaine, but not the main computer. I'll leave that in your hands. Of course, if you mute the main computer, you'll have to unmute it when you ask your question. But getting back to you, Steve, you're talking about acts of subversion, really. And how is it that a citizen who from the time of birth really is taught to obey authority, right? That's what one's relationship with one's parents generally amounts to. How can a citizen know when it's time to be to resist and to conduct these acts of resistance? How does one know? What are the signals and the parameters to reassure one that they're doing the right thing?
Well, I suppose there's two things I would say that. The first, I always have to say, people sometimes say, is the book that I wrote before with John Jackson, the book I've written now, is it a handbook for protest? And I always have to say no, because actually that would be incredibly impertinent, if you like. I'm sitting in great comfort in my home in London and I'm not risking anything. And many of these actions are extremely dangerous to take, extremely dangerous. And so it would be really highly inappropriate for me to go say, go out, go and do this stuff in the full knowledge that people may, suffer quite grievously from that. But to take head on your question about when people know, I mean, you talked about us, we're being taught to be subservient to authority. I guess in some ways that's true, but I would also argue that we are taught, hopefully taught, often taught from an early age, that we bear responsibility for our own actions and our own morality, if you like, and that, we need to decide, and that it's not just, you can't, we've actually learned it in the war crimes context. You can't just say, oh, well, somebody told me to. As we all know, I was only obeying orders has absolutely been dismissed as an argument that that can be taken. And modern Germany, in fact, is an incredibly interesting case of this. It's taught so strongly throughout the education system. Obviously, Germany, with its particular history, makes it stronger than any other country that I know of, what? You are responsible for everything that's happening. And in a sense that as a citizen, you are also holding your own government to account at every level. And if your government is demanding things which you feel are not right, then, ask your own heart what you should be doing. How you ask your own heart, in other words, how you form those decisions, I guess each of us kind of has a certain knowledge. I think that the greater question really is, how great are those dangers? And that the person in the middle of the difficulties is going to understand instinctively better than anybody. I certainly would absolutely understand. I would more than understand. I'd probably be in the same position myself. people who do not wish to take great risks. Why would they? And remember, it's not even just taking risks for yourself. You're likely to spoil your parents get into trouble, your children get into trouble, your children can't go to university or they get kicked out of school. There are so many knock-ons, which nothing is always about you yourself. So it's a very big decision when you're taking those things. I think that sense, though, of the moral compass is kind of relevant. And that's, again, going back to the Havel essay. Well, I love that Havel essay. And the greengrocer, just the ordinary guy who at a certain point goes, you know what? No. And there are certainly repercussions for him. But I also think it's very striking that very often, not always certainly, but very often people who've taken that step, the political bungee jump, if you like, they've stepped off the precipice, they often feel incredibly energized by that very scary moment. And there's a quote that I'm very fond of from a Czech guy who said to my colleague at the Independent, Edward Lucas, he'd been beaten during the demonstrations of November 1989 in Prague. And he said, he'd never taken part in a protest before. He was on the ground. And he said, as I lay there on the ground being beaten, I felt free for the first time. And I think that kind of goes to the heart of it. He'd just gone like, no, this can no longer be right. And the this, in that case, actually was people reacting very strongly to others who had been beaten a few days earlier. People that was a moral frontier that for people was a frontier for. So I think that, in other words, to sum that up, I think that we all kind of have somewhere within us a sense of what's right or what's wrong. And the question of when it is worth or not worth protesting, that's a really difficult question which each person can answer. And crucially, just to finish on this, Havel himself made clear, you don't know if you're going to win. It's not like if I do it, I will win. It's perfectly possible you may die and still nothing substantial will have changed, but you're still hoping for your children. And that, to take Burma, for example, is a clear case in point. And it's been decades of not seeing change, but the protests that happened and all the different ones, the biggest one in recent years in 2007, but been many, many before that, eventually create the change. And so again, go back to Havel's phrase, it's about living in truth in the meantime for its own sake. And you hope that the change may come. And above all, of course, you hope that you will live to see those changes.
Terrific. Elaine? Any questions from either Indiana University or from the chat room?
So I'll get the ball rolling actually, because Steve, just listening to you, as somebody who's lived in I've lived in the United States for a number of years now, and obviously the kind of acts of resistance you're describing are in moments of great peril. In Poland and Burma and so on. But we're seeing acts of resistance now here in the United States around the issue of race relations and equality.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious to know what your assessment is, and I apologise for the football followers if I pronounce his name incorrectly, but Colin Kaepernick, who has, as you probably know, been taking a knee during the national anthem instead of standing with his hand on his heart, and has caused quite an uproar in this country, and it's a very small act of resistance and yet so powerful. I'm just wondering, what's your response? What's your feeling about that? Do you see that as a potentially successful act? How does it fit into your worldview of resistance?
I see. I mean, as the title of the first book said, but in a sense it's the theme of the second book as well. I think the small acts can be at least as relevant as the large ones. On the United States more generally, I think that those taking part will be much more knowledgeable than I was a few years ago. I felt shamefully ignorant when I was writing and realized the civil rights movement, the extent of the risks that people were taking then, and the food counter story and the freedom riders and all the things that people were doing. And it's funny that as a European, I was thinking, yeah, well, bad stuff had happened, but I don't think one quite realized the extent that this was built into the system, the violent racism that was so built into the system. That comparisons with South African apartheid were very justifiable in many, many ways. And people obviously risked their lives again and again. And so those stories from the 50s and the 60s, of course, before that as well, but 50s and 60s, which I focused on there, it was interesting. Often those were tiny little actions that people were taking. It was simply the fact that you were going to go on sitting at this lunch counter. And when you got arrested, somebody else would come along and sit at the lunch counter. And when they got arrested, somebody else would come. And the arrests would continue and continue. It was such a small action. But of course, the symbolic quality of that small action of merely sitting down in a place where someone else said you were not supposed to sit down, and crucially, doing that in a very non-violent way. That was also a whole story behind how the non-violence was written into the script, if you like. Was crucial. So coming to today's stuff, yes, I mean, I think Black Lives Matter is an incredibly important movement, and I'm sure that everyone watching this will have seen the unbelievably emblematic picture of the woman a couple of months ago standing and kind of allowing herself to be arrested, picked up by these massive, great, well-armed police. And she is there looking very fragile, but actually her fragility was a kind of strength, really. I imagine that photograph will be certainly a contender for World Press Photo because it summed up everything so much with that, both fragility and strength. So I think those kind of things clearly get a nation talking. You guys are in the States, I'm not, but certainly seen from this side of the Atlantic, it feels as though the country is talking about these things more than ever before, although of course the issues are absolutely not new. And it's also spread over actually to European countries as well, but that's a different issue. And to take the thing of, for example, national anthem, yeah, again, these tiny little things I think are absolutely crucial. Often they get people talking, they become a symbolic thing which kind of just tips things over. One of the stories that I've got in the new book is from the Australian runner who pulled out, Aboriginal herself, and then pulled out the Aboriginal flag as she ran around the track during her victory lap. Now that was forbidden and she was told, please don't do that again. And she did do it again 3 days later and she was rebuked for having done it. But then she continued to win and actually she was acknowledged as, of course she had the right to do that. And she became a kind of leader of herself, and many other things in terms of Aboriginal rights were kind of addressed partly through that one apparently tiny action of which flag you happen to be waving, or where you place your hand or don't place your hand. I think all of those are very, very interesting moments. And of course, that went back even to the Hitler Olympics. We've seen so many occasions where there've been important small acts which have implications. And as I always say, again, it's cliche stuff, but it is absolutely true. It's the small acts coming together which create something much, much greater.
Elaine, did you want to follow up?
I have so many questions, so I apologize for. Okay, I have another one for you.
Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah, please go ahead. Sorry.
So I'm sort of intrigued. As I think a lot of. I don't know whether to call you a former journalist because I don't think you ever become a former journalist.
Anyway, it's difficult.
But this sort of transition that you have made, and to some extent, I suppose others we know have made, including myself, from journalism into a more sort of advocacy existence. I mean, how do you see the role of the journalist? When you think back on your experiences working as a journalist, do you think of some of your reporting also as acts of resistance? And if you do, how do you straighten out the ethics of that for yourself?
In a small kind of way, I guess. So I was incredibly privileged as a journalist. I mean, The Independent, when it started, now sadly, actually, it no longer even exists in print. It's become one of the first main British papers to go just online as part of a kind of shrinking back, if you like, that we're seeing in journalism more generally. But when it started and launched, foreign was incredibly important to it. And as Nelson mentioned at the beginning, I was there from the beginning in 1986. And I was unbelievably privileged that in 1988, I became the East Europe editor. And so for the next few years, I had kind of what I still regard as the nicest job in the entire world, which was being there before the revolutions, during the revolutions, and then afterwards. And those three bits, before the crowds around, when the crowds were all there, and describing that, and then looking at the complications afterwards. All three of those are really relevant. I would like to think that a sense of morality, that sounds rather a pompous word, but a sense of, what's right or wrong, was one of the things that interested me in my reporting throughout that period. And especially, for example, at the beginning of the Balkan Wars, I'd covered the Balkans quite a lot, which I know you were there as well, and was in Bosnia, was in Kosovo, was in actually various of those conflicts. And to take Bosnia especially, 1992 when the Bosnia conflict began, it was incredibly difficult to get that issue onto the table. Politicians just didn't want to be interested. Terrible things were happening in Sarajevo, the Bosnian capital. People just didn't want to know. And in fact, it was at one point so difficult to get in that very little news was coming out, and therefore the politicians could ignore it. And I don't regard this as a large act of resistance at all, but I do remember having quite fierce arguments with my news editor about a story that I really wanted to go on the front page about some stuff that was happening in Sarajevo. Now, every journalist, including me for sure, has vanity reasons for why they want things on the front page, but I would like to think that that argument, the way I remember it in my head, was driven more by my knowledge that if this goes on the front page, the British Foreign Secretary will read this story in front of him because it's regarded as where it kind of gets, although I was, I hope, obeying the basic rules of journalism of, you know, impartiality and this, that, and the other. And I certainly was always eager to make sure that the other side, you know, did get its coverage. But when you see civilians being killed for no good reason by people who have no good reason, well, actually, there never is a good reason to kill civilians, and I think that I was driven by that sense of saying this needs to be out there, and without glorifying, but I mean, like many journalists took far more risks than I did, and I admire massively those who've done. But I guess many of us who worked on the Bosnian conflict did feel that humanitarian imperative of like, I need to report on this stuff in order that people will react, and the politicians reacted too little. So for me, when I moved from journalism to the NGO role, to NGO advocacy, at that point, it was almost a natural segue. It was more difficult to find editors, not just at the Independent, but anywhere else, who were really that interested in hearing complicated stories about foreign places, which was kind of what interested me above all. And working for an NGO, I could, initially Human Rights Watch and then Amnesty International, there my actual role would be to do it at one remove, energize people. I would talk to the politicians and try and get them to wake up. But also I'd be talking to editors, I'd be talking to reporters, I'd be talking to commissioning editors. And I sometimes thought of myself a little bit as a commissioning editor at one remove, in a sense, of, you know, if I had a coffee with a friend or I had lunch or just had a good phone call, and they would say, wow, this is shocking. And then they would write a big piece on Uzbekistan, Sudan, or wherever it was. So, yeah, I think that many journalists have this, certainly, and I hope it's still strong. I think it's still strong of people thinking, I need to tell the truth, and if you're lucky, then telling the truth powerfully can have some real world impact as well.
You know, Elaine, I'll let you look for any questions that may have come in on chat or anyone in the room there. In the meantime, you know, some of the things you said earlier, Steve, reminded me of Muhammad Ali. I remember his acts of resistance in the early and mid 60s. He was controversial, and it wasn't by any means certainly that he would end up being successful, certainly becoming the iconic figure that he ended up being. But I also think of the Tank Man in Tiananmen Square on June 4th, 1989. Some of our younger listeners may not be familiar with this image, but there was a man who hasn't been entirely officially identified ever, to the best of my knowledge, who stood in Tiananmen Square during a period when there were very violent protests and a very violent crackdown. He stood in front of tanks, and it became an image in which in many ways captured the reality of those days. Now, his act in some respects was not successful. He's not remembered. He's not Muhammad Ali. He's not in the headlines. He's not a hero. Is this a reason for us to be pessimistic?
Well, I mean, there's always a million reasons to be pessimistic. And if we look around the world today, any of us could kind of come up with that long list. In quite a few different parts of the world. And certainly in China, there's been far too little change since, as you say, that massacre of peaceful protesters that was, again, 27 years ago, so a long time ago. But I would say there's quite an important part that goes with it. That guy is not forgotten. That image, which I hope many may be familiar with, it's certainly worth looking up. This image of incredible courage and dignity, a man just standing there with his shopping bags in front of the tanks and saying basically like, okay, come and run me over if you want, but. And that image is famous to us all still, and above all, it's still incredibly important within China. So again, a little story that actually I do include in the new book, In Street Spirit, is taking that tank man image. But from a couple of years ago, every year on the June 4th anniversary, there are different protests, different events, obviously, especially in Hong Kong, but also in mainland China. And there was a lovely one a couple of years ago where they took some yellow plastic ducks and photoshopped them in. So instead of the tanks, you have man standing in front of three like kids' yellow bath ducks, basically. And that was kind of so interesting, and that went viral, basically, including in mainland China itself. The word big yellow duck became like a banned hashtag, the Chinese version of that, but the whole thing went viral because people were so, interested by it and engaged by it. And that at some level, again, it's the creativity and humor at some level, but above all, of course, it's the keeping alive the memory. And this was another way of smuggling itself past the censorship mechanisms, which again, if people think have forgotten it, then how come the Chinese authorities get so antsy, get so worried every time that the June anniversary comes up and words like June the 4th are banned, and as it gets closer to the day, lots more, even the words today will sometimes get banned as a hashtag as you get closer. And the ways of commemorating are constantly pushed back on. And at the same time, people themselves are pushing back on the pushing back. So yeah, we don't know what happened to that guy. We have no idea. The common assumption is that he somewhere. Another version is that he got away and no one ever actually found him and he melted into the shadows. We simply don't know. But what we do know is that his action continues to have impact so many years later. And I think that's the interesting thing, is it's very, very difficult to assess, basically, how great the impact of something like that may be.
Thank you, Steve. Before we wrap up the session later, I do want to get into some of the current situations around the world. But before doing so, I wanted to try to frame the debate a little bit. And by that, I mean this. When I was a journalist, and in a way I agree with Elaine, once a journalist, always a journalist, at least in the way we see things. But when I was a practicing journalist, we used to say, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. And that was a way of saying that a person's perspective can change radically depending on a person's prejudices, biases, beliefs, values, where they come from, etc. And it seems to me that the same holds true of human rights. What can appear a human rights violation in one country might not be viewed as such in another country, or even in the relevant country itself. And here's an example. The United States often accuses China of violating its citizens' human rights by muzzling a free press and jailing dissidents. In the meantime, China often accuses the United States of tolerating economic inequalities and of poisonous race relations, which we've touched on already in this session. So my question then, Steve, is: are human rights fundamentally subjective, or is there one set of rights that everyone can agree on, or are human rights just politics by another name?
No, human rights are definitely not politics by another name. I mean, the phrase to go back to is what was agreed in 1948, which it was called with good reason the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and countries around the world of different political persuasions signed up. They didn't necessarily obey it. That's another whole different thing, but definitely absolutely universal. So you described there, well, let me pick apart a couple of the elements of your question. On the one hand, yeah, there's the terrorist versus freedom fighter. When I was at The Independent, for a while, I think they dropped it then again, but I actually quite enjoyed it as a reporter when there was a system where we were not allowed as reporters to use the word terrorist, let alone freedom fighter. But instead of talking about terrorists, you would simply describe what people have done. And it was kind of quite interesting how liberating it was that you didn't need to talk about a terrorist attack. If you described an attack in which 30 civilians were killed, including, you know, children of 3 and an old man doing this and an old lady selling potatoes, that kind of your moral outrage at what has happened is not influenced by whether the word terrorist is or is not included in the story. And the word murder, of course, is possible to include in the story because that's, you know, a fact simply, somebody going about their business. You commit murder, it may be mass murder, you commit massacres of civilians, and all of those things which describe and many adjectives that if wanted, you can throw onto that. But frankly, the facts themselves are shocking enough. To take an obvious American example, if you talk about flying a plane into buildings and many people being killed through that, that has a moral outrage which doesn't need the word terrorist attached to it. So I always have found actually that thing can become slightly sterile pretty quickly because, as you say, it can be flipped so often. They say, wow, look at so-and-so, wasn't he called a terrorist and later he became prime minister. And the list of people who did become prime minister having done, quote, terrorist things is long. But I think that sense of not killing those who did nothing deserve to be killed, that's frankly should be seen as a crime and is under human rights law and under basic moral laws, if you like, is seen as a crime in any case. So to take the bigger thing of the universality, yes, I would certainly say they are a universe. You kind of expect me to say that working for Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch before that. But I think your example of China, the States, is really interesting. You're quite right that it's always been set up that way. And both sides will say, well, don't attack us on that because we can attack you on the other one. Especially in past years, that tended to be that one side, for example, the US or Western powers would talk about civil and political rights, and especially, quote, the other side, which in the Cold War era would be either Soviet Union, Russia, or China especially, would say, yes, but we have all these economic rights. In fact, what's happened in the meantime is that within the consensus of the human rights world, including not just human rights NGOs, but the UN human rights mechanisms, the economic and social rights are also human rights issues. And then the one that you mentioned there in passing, but obviously core, as we discussed a little bit earlier as well, race relations and racial discrimination, that is absolutely, there are many conventions where it's written into, but frankly, the morality of that is clear. There's discrimination against somebody for the color of their skin, because of their religion, because of a whole range of other things, from their, you know, gender to disability to so many other things. All of those are unacceptable, and those are unacceptable around the world. And it's really interesting that when people say, oh, well, actually, in this part of the world, it doesn't count, you can nearly always find, I think, that those are people who have a vested interest. Either they're sitting comfortably in their armchair and don't want to think about it elsewhere, or they are part of the ruling establishment that kind of doesn't want things to change in the part where they are. And just to finish off, I would say I think that rights are very much about having choices. So to take a classic one that comes up, which is of course quite discussed at the moment, including especially in France, where you are, is the issue of headscarves, wearing headscarves, what you should wear, what you shouldn't wear, what you may wear, what you may not wear. People are quite rightly, I think, offended by the fact that in Saudi Arabia there are very, very strict rules about what women must wear, even if they do not wish to. Under the Taliban in Afghanistan, very strict laws, punishable sometimes by death if you were wearing the wrong things, if you were not sufficiently covered up. But interestingly, even some years ago in Turkey, you had the opposite, that people could get into trouble because they were wearing a headscarf and were told not to, because we are a secular country. Well, yeah, that's fine to be a secular country, but if someone chooses to wear a headscarf, why should they not do so? And in France, of course, that's come up recently, what's described as the burkini, in other words, but it's a slightly misleading phrase because it isn't really usually a burqa type of thing at all, which is a complete cover-up, but it's a bikini which covers up large amounts of parts of the body. And you think, well, why shouldn't people be making those choices if they wish to? And I speaking personally, but certainly human rights organizations, would feel very uncomfortable about both of those elements. On the one hand, deeply uncomfortable that Saudi women are forced to dress in a certain way, even if they would prefer not to. And many practicing Muslims would prefer not to. And equally, if a government which prides itself on being so secular is also forbidding people to make the choices that they have made. So I do think that rights are absolutely universal and they're about choices.
Elaine, questions from Indiana?
You guys are hitting everything, anything I even think of. So.
Well, actually, while you were talking about that, I was just thinking about, obviously, this theme has come up a lot in the presidential election. And, you know, we've had Donald Trump talking about this idea of registering all Muslims. And you were talking earlier about, you know, when do you know that it's time to take action? So I'm just wondering, you know, because I suppose that for many of those who would oppose this idea of people of any religious identification having to register are rather assuming that this is just talk. But obviously talk can have consequences. I'm just wondering how that filters through for you.
Yeah. Human rights organizations are eager not to pronounce on party political issues. I have to say, it does come quite difficult in the US election context at the moment when you have one candidate coming up with such extraordinary proposals, including the one that you mentioned there, which is so clearly in both, it's interesting, it's a kind of classic thing, clearly in breach of all obvious rights, but also so destabilizing for society itself. And I think that's an important thing to remember, is that actually the removal of rights, which those who do the removing often say it's in order to increase security, increase stability. But actually, again and again, we see that you get less stability through that being done. And I certainly think, as you say, it's such a kind of insane suggestion, this complete ban, that you think, well, surely it's just talk and doesn't mean anything. But I think the permissiveness is actually very important. And in my own country, in the UK, we've had an interesting example of that recently. We've had the Brexit vote, the vote for Britain to leave the European Union. And that was strongly fed, not entirely. There were different reasons why people voted for Brexit, but certainly quite a nationalist tone of voice was pretty strong during that. And we want our country back was the way that was framed. And it was there was definitely a strong xenophobic undertone. Now, the leaders may not themselves have been xenophobes, but what we have seen since the successful Brexit vote is a massive increase in xenophobic attacks on, for example, East Europeans, but also on Black British people who've been in this country for generations sometimes. Certainly people who have been born here are being challenged to quote, go back. And equally East Europeans who've been here for a number of years and who, you know, done fantastic work for this country, are being told to quote go back, and are being not just being told to go back, but they're also being attacked on the streets, and we've also had killings since that Brexit vote. Now, the politicians themselves, of course, were not encouraging those killings, but I do think the sense of permissiveness that you give by changing the dialogue and by fostering mistrust and hatred, that can help create a place where really dangerous things happen. And once you do have violence, of course, the danger of violence being matched with violence is equally severe. So I think that politicians everywhere in the world need to think very carefully about the implications of what they are saying. They shouldn't just be playing to the ones who they think might vote for them if they say outrageous things, but also any politician should be thinking of his or her country and how to create a better stability for that country and therefore for the region and therefore for the world, I would say.
Steve, I can't resist this question. A lot of human rights issues around the world currently, many, but if you had to list the top 3 human rights problems currently, what would your list include?
Wow. It's always tough. Actually, again, quite for very good reasons, human rights organizations will always completely dodge that question. So I'll probably partly dodge it as well. There are so many places where things are so horrific. I mean, I think that the failures are so great. Syria is the obvious word that comes to mind in terms of the millions who've been forced out, the hundreds of thousands who have died. And there are other places where terrible, terrible things have happened, including in relatively recent years, in the past 20 years. Absolutely horrendous numbers of different people have suffered in different ways. But I think that what we're seeing with Syria, and that has in common with some of the worst, appalling things that we've seen in the past 20, 30 years, say, for example, the Rwandan genocide or other things, is that even when we knew, the world's politicians, knew what was happening, the failure to react to that in good time, I think, is truly shocking. I'm not sure that problem is worse than it was, but it's not getting better. And there's something which theoretically has been signed up for called the responsibility to protect, which is kind of within the context of the UN, that the idea is you cannot look away from really bad stuff happening. And that came up kind of in the aftermath of the Rwandan genocide of 1994, the genocide at Srebrenica in Bosnia in 1995, and a bunch of other things. But the world does have a responsibility to react. And that doesn't mean, I hasten to say, by going and dropping bombs in places, but it just means putting pressure and waking up. Of course, we haven't really seen that on Syria. And so I think on the one hand, it's these terrible things that are going on, terrible things happening within Syria, terrible things happening with the spillover from Syria's borders, and of course the sheer moral abdication of those who then risk their lives crossing the Mediterranean. They come not only from Syria, but also from very, very difficult conflicts in Africa, also Afghanistan, elsewhere. But many of those are also from Syria, seeking to cross the Mediterranean, taking unbelievable risks, dying in huge numbers. 3,000 this year alone have died. And yet countries around the world, and that includes most European countries. The US has been a little bit better recently, but to be honest, all of the richest countries in the world have done absolutely nothing by comparison with the much, much poorer countries who are taking an incredible burden of carrying these refugees. So I think that sense of the failure to understand that we are all joined up in a single world, I think that's the greatest failure that we face. And, sadly and depressingly, it is going to come back to haunt us, that if we fail to address things, we pave the way for worse things again to happen in the future with, if you like, the dispossessed generations with an enormous sense of bitterness and all that comes with it. So people were, we haven't quite got the money or the time to focus on these things. It's an incredibly short-sighted attitude. And I wish I could think that these things were going to be addressed and addressable within the immediate years to come, but I think we've got a very, very high mountain to climb, to be honest.
Right, I'm going to turn it back to Indiana. I think there's a question from chat. Is that right, Elaine?
Yeah, we have a question from Hannah. Hannah would like to know, how can you act as an advocate for subjective human rights in foreign countries without appearing condescending and being seen as though you're trying to force your beliefs on others, even where it's a fundamental human right, but it's not seen that way there? And she's thinking particularly of gender equality. So how do you do that without seeming condescending, I think, is the nut of the question.
I think the simplest answer to that is that it should never be just from the outside. The outside should merely be giving voice to concerns which are already inside. I think if organizations were doing things which people in the country themselves didn't want, it kind of wouldn't make sense at all. But that isn't the case. And so the most important partners for any human rights organization, but also for the UN and others, is those within the country who are brave enough to stand up. But they are taking incredible side, can be acting, if you like, as the megaphone. And within Saudi Arabia, for example, there's some crazy brave women who, to take just one tiny example, will go driving, which, as I'm sure many of the listeners know, is one of the many, many, many things that women are not allowed to do. Now, driving, frankly, is not the most important thing in the world. Let's be plain about that. But again, it has that symbolic quality that if you can get arrested and put on trial, and sometimes put on trial instantly in a security court, a high security court, because you're allegedly challenging the security of the country, just for being a woman who demands the right to drive, that has many, many implications beyond that. And gender equality in many different, I mean, there's so many, quite apart from the moral element to it, there are so many practical benefits. So for example, maternal mortality, the number of those who die or survive in childbirth, we can see that gender equality has an incredible importance there of reducing maternal mortality. In other words, reducing the risks of having a baby. The statistics are absolutely plain. Now, I would like to think there is nobody in the world who thinks it's a good idea when either babies or their mothers die in childbirth or die in the first 5 years of life. But what we're seeing is that somehow, oh, we mustn't have that equality issue. The women themselves who are most affected don't, of course, think like that. And it's those who purport to speak on their behalf, but wrongly so. So I do think, as going back to my earlier answer, I would certainly say that human rights are a universal issue. And the most important people who can ever speak out, whether it's about what's happening in Eastern Congo or Afghanistan or Syria or whichever issue it is, it's the people from the area themselves. And I, as a human rights advocate, if I was doing work with, for example, ambassadors at the UN Security Council, for me it was incredibly important if I was joined by somebody from that country, I knew that the impact of what I was saying could always be doubled by the presence of that person too.
Earlier you talked a little bit about there's a bit of a echo here. I don't know why. Hold on. Anyways, earlier you spoke about terrorism, and I must agree with you. I mean, Elaine and I worked at Reuters, and we worked under the same premise that we didn't use the word terrorist, at least initially, to label people because it implied a value judgment, which we needed to avoid if we were going to be impartial and unbiased. My question, though, is about the line between nonviolent civil disobedience and armed militancy. Is it never proper to cross that line? Or if it is, how does one know when it becomes proper? Sorry, Steve, I'm trying to turn over to you, but your mic may still be.
Can you hear me now?
Now I hear you. Yeah, sorry. You want to start over?
Yeah, and sorry, you froze actually slightly, and I didn't hear all of your question. But I did hear the beginning of it to do with armed militancy and if or when that might be justified, if I heard the heart of the question correctly originally. I think it's interesting in my lifetime, and some of our lifetimes are around this table. The narrative has changed quite significantly. So once upon a time, there was that sense that liberation was about there's some bad guys, and then the good guys come along, and the bad guys have got lots of guns, and so the good guys come along, and they've got lots of guns themselves, probably given them by one of the superpowers. And with those guns, they manage to get rid of the bad guys. They move into the presidential palace, and everyone lives happily ever after. Ha ha ha! Because actually, of course, again and again, those armed revolutions often led to new serial abuses, which often lasted for decades afterwards. There's a very interesting book written by a couple of US academics called Why Civil Resistance Works. And it's fantastically interesting because you often hear people say, yeah, well, you've cherry-picked some nice examples of nonviolent resistance and that work. But when you've got really nasty guys, then obviously you need to pick up a gun, and that's the way you're going to make it work. And I can absolutely understand logically how you get to that place. If you've seen people being, arrested, beaten, killed again and again, you think, I can only do it with a gun. And that kind of has a logical thing. But what is interesting by this book by Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan, Why Civil Resistance Works, they went through, and one of them started as a massive skeptic, incidentally, and was then challenged to look at the empirical evidence. So they looked at the evidence from 100 years, and it's incredible how often the non-violent opposition has actually been successful, including in very, very difficult circumstances. Crucially, again, it's kind of not surprising when you hear it, but it's kind of good to be reminded. If they then looked at the stability over the 10 years after the change, where there had been either a non-violent change or a violent change, where there had been the violent change, the chances of getting stability afterwards were dramatically reduced. I mean, really, really dramatically reduced. And I found that very telling. It wasn't exactly surprising. So I've kind of dodged slightly your question about the moral right to pick up arms, but I would stick with the practical one of like, really, are you sure that's actually what's going to make things better? And I think it's pretty hard to find examples where the armed struggle has not then become toxic in a range of different contexts. I do understand why people may turn to weapons. I do understand kind of on a if you like, socio-political level, or political level, or human level even, why people might turn to them. But actually, it's incredible how often that hasn't worked. And Syria is a really interesting example. One of the guys who was involved in some wonderful, creative, non-violent protests at the beginning, and then his friends started turning to the weapons, and he, at that time, said, yeah, but he's got more guns than we have. We're not going to kind of win this battle. If he takes the guns, Gene Sharp is the name of another of the kind of gurus, if you like, who has repeatedly pointed out that the bad guys will probably, you're really going for their strongest suit. If you're going for the guns and the tanks, they've got like a limitless supply of those very often. And so simply in pragmatic terms, what you're able to do to unsettle the regime, which of course needs to split it open in many ways, is one of the ways that you win. What might seem to be, quote, an easy fix, in practice is pretty much never an easy fix. And just to finish off one tiny historical example, but within South Africa, the African National Congress, the ANC, it had tiny elements of violence as at one part of its strategy, but actually where it made most progress was where it went down the completely non-violent route. And certainly going back to one that we mentioned earlier, the civil rights movement in the States, there were many there who argued, no, we need violence because, this is so bad that only violence can end the violence, if you like, the racist violence. But actually that unbelievably powerful and very dangerous. I mean, being a non-violent resistor, that's not the soft option. It's an absolutely incredibly tough option. And as some of your listeners may know, but it is fascinating the detail, those civil rights people, they practiced again and again and again, being beaten, being abused, being beaten, being abused. And they honed that practice in order to go like, okay, do what you want. And in the end, that non-violence actually was what won that particular battle. And I think that's true in many, many different contexts.
Great. We've gone past our time, but I wanted to turn it back to Indiana just in case there's another question there.
I think we have exhausted our list of the list of one for a very long time.
There's a lot of feedback. Sorry.
Yeah. At your end as well.
Okay. Well, we'll listen. I want to thank Steve, and I want to thank Indiana for this. Before we sign off, I'm going to try to do this technological wizardry here and share my screen, just so we can show the cover to Mr. Crawshaw's book, which will be coming out next year. You have a month for that issue?
Yeah, so that's it's just kind of on its way to the printers now. So I was actually just emailing with my editor, final proofs I hope in the next week or two, and that will be coming out at the beginning of February. Certainly in the UK, I think in the United States it may be a little bit later. I'm not quite sure on the date for the United States, but in the UK it'll be at the beginning of February.
Terrific. Well, with that, our speaker, Steve Crawshaw, and Indiana for taking part in this broadcast. The first one of this academic year. We have Rami Puri to speak on the Middle East next week. I'll be circulating more information on that before the end of this week. And thank you all for your participation, and have a good day and good acts of resistance, large or small.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure. Thank you.